Thank you, everyone, for joining. I appreciate it today. We're going to move through this pretty quick. I know your time is valuable. I want to tell you this all started because one of the agencies asked us if we could provide some short virtual meeting information on environmental issues that realtors run into on a regular basis. And so we have been developing these. Today, we're going to talk about mold. And there's so much to talk about on mold that I've separated it into two classes. And by the end of this one, you're going to say, thank God we're not taking all of it today. And we also have one that's been very popular on vermiculite. And vermiculite is a type of insulation that's found in some attics. But I want to tell you about a secret that's involved in vermiculite. There's a trust fund. And so I will explain those whenever we give the vermiculite training program as well, because it's beneficial to you and to your clients because you can offer something that most other people don't know about. But today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about us, and then the rest of this is all education on mold, and mold basically 101 from the beginning. But it's going to give you some tips on what to look for. Most of you know us probably from the residential side for asbestos testing and remediation, mold testing and remediation, or lead type work. But we do a lot of other things, and only 10% of our revenue here as a company comes from residential type work. We are mostly in hospitals, and we're at Boeing and Monsanto, and which is Bayer now, and Mallinckrodt and all those places on a daily basis. We have 45 people here. And we work in a lot of different states. We've been around for 33 years. In fact, we do a lot of infection control training, even for the Cleveland Clinic. If you're a worker for the Cleveland Clinic, you do not work in their facilities worldwide unless you've had our training. So we'll go through, you're going to see some overlap in some of that as we go through. But what we're here today to talk about is something that unfortunately we run into with our real estate deals, and that's mold, because the building inspector gets in there and all of a sudden they find mold that shows up in the report, and then you're calling somebody like us or you're trying to figure out what to do. I want to explain why this develops, why it colonizes, what the health effects are associated with actually some mistakes that we've made that I want you to know about too, so you don't make the same mistakes. I mean, that's what we're here to do, is learn about things. And then we're going to talk pretty much focus on moisture and what's real and what's hype concerning that. First off, I want to explain why mold seems to be in the news or in these reports so often now lately. In the last 10 years, it's really popped up. And it's because of the publicity surrounding the health effects associated with mold, as well as lawsuits are skyrocketing on mold issues around the country. Doctors are concerned. You're going to see a couple things where we've had doctors, I've had 2 in the last week, that have called us to go in and inspect people's homes because of sickness. And then 30% of our children have allergies or asthma. So mold is there, it's prevalent, and people are starting to pay more attention to mold issues, especially in homes. Some of these may be very minor because mold is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and we can always find some mold. But we're going to talk about when it's a big problem, when it's not a problem. But to understand that, we need to know, where does this stuff come from? What is this? And mold's unique in the fact that it lacks chlorophyll. And what that means is it doesn't need light for it to develop. And so it's one of those unusual type of microorganisms. We call it fungus. And it's not a plant, but it's a multi-celled organism that can grow and develop without any sunlight. So it's very unusual, and it's part of nature's system on breaking down things like leaves and wood, and a lot of decay that occurs is all because of the mold working on those things. So it is a very important part of our ecosystem. It's just that when we get into a situation like this that I'm showing in that right-hand picture, this is when it can become an issue. These are the essentials, and I'll go over these once again later in a few minutes. But mold, besides oxygen, and we're going to take that as something we all need anyway to be there to look at it, but it needs temperature, and it has to have a temperature range in between 40 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, we also at times take care of the penguins down at the zoo because they are highly allergic to an Aspergillus type penicillium mold that grows in the Antarctic below zero. So it's unusual. But for what we're talking about, we don't have any penguins that we're selling houses to. We're talking about that temperature range 40 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It also needs a nutrient base, and that's something for it to eat, for it to actually grow and what we call colonize. And in this picture on the right, this is a medical facility that was located out in Fenton, and it was unoccupied for about 6 months. The roof leaked, and the carpet down there, that gray carpet at the bottom, got wet, and it created enough humidity in the building that all this mold started to grow on all the walls inside the building. So we have to have moisture, and that moisture can be an actual water event, or it can be relative humidity. And we'll look at that relative humidity in a few minutes. But let me tell you about some stories. This picture isn't taken from our patient, but we had a lady that called. She had all 10 of her toes were actually green, and I mean they were green. And she had more medication that doctors had given her to try to get rid of this and to deal with why her toes were green. And finally, she called one day and said, I really want my home inspected. It's a condo. It's on the first floor. We went over there and inspected it and found that there was moisture coming up from the slab, the concrete slab under her condo on the first floor, that was creating the carpet just to be damp enough. And on top of it, she was a heavy smoker. And if you've been in homes that have from heavy smokers, we see that yellow nicotine that builds up on the walls. Well, that nicotine is like glue, and it sticks to the carpet. And what would happen is she walked through this condo with her bare feet. The nicotine would act like a glue, and the water moisture where mold was already developing and colonizing in the carpet would stick to her feet. And she couldn't even actually wash this off. So this Aspergillus was really the cause of this lady's green toes. I mean, it was a wild thing. And after we removed the carpet, put in a vapor barrier, and got rid of all the mold in there, her toes cleared up, and she got rid of all that medication that she was on from doctors that didn't really know what was going on. And so we do see quite a few doctors now, especially the holistic type doctors, that are asking certain patients, hey, let's test your home and find out. For one example is we've got a FedEx driver, and you know, these guys are in great shape. They're in and out of these trucks. They're lifting packages all day. This guy, he can't get out of bed. And the problem is he goes to the doctor. He tries to explain, I have no energy whatsoever. My body feels okay, but I don't have any energy. And so finally, one doctor, after they had prescribed all kinds of psychiatric drugs and things like that, thinking he has depression, said, let's check your house. We went in there, we checked the house, and we found he had Stachybotrys type mold. That's what we call black mold. And it was a toxin mold that was actually making this guy sick. And after it was removed, and about a month later, the guy was back to his normal self, back to moving in great shape and doing things. So sometimes mold has effects that can be both an allergen effect or a toxin effect. And it can be in the same house, and people experience both differently. So we'll talk about an allergen on one hand, and we all pretty much know what that is because we've got a lot of mold in our air here in St. Louis, especially during the summer. And so a lot of people are experiencing allergy-like symptoms. The sneezing, the runny nose, the eye irritations, those are allergen-type reactions to being around mold. It doesn't mean everybody has the same reaction. Everybody is a little bit different. And then we have toxin-type reactions to some types of mold, and that's our Stachybotrys or Chaetomium-type molds. Those can be deadly to people. But even common molds can be deadly to people that are immunocompromised, people that are going through cancer treatments, or transplant patients, or some elderly people. And so that's what one of my specialties is in the hospital, is we look at hospital-acquired infections, but it's related to mold because mold travels on dust particles. And here's an example of what we're talking about, and I want you to kind of understand where we're coming from with mold and how it can impact. Kaylee here is 2 years old. She's had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, cancer, and she has been fighting cancer for 2 years and is finally in remission. You can imagine the wear and tear on her parents for these 2 years, worried about her baby. She's in the hospital getting checkups, and the next thing you know, she dies. And the reason why she dies on the pathology report states exposure to aspergillus. And the reason she was exposed to aspergillus was merely because construction workers with dust on their clothes walked by her room. It was enough to impact her health because of her low immune tolerance levels. And it wasn't just her, it was Matthew that was 5 and Sierra that was 9 that also died. And the pathology report from the hospital stated exposure to aspergillus. Aspergillus is a type of mold. So you can see how dangerous this can be to some people, especially those that are immunocompromised. And we've got a different situation in a hospital versus what you're running into when we sell a home. But I do want you to understand this can have a great impact on some people. And in fact, I've been around when somebody walks into a house, so they're inspecting it, and all of a sudden they tell you, as a realtor, your buyer says, you know what, I'm highly sensitive to mold, and I'm feeling something here that's just not right. And in the past, and I've made this mistake myself, I thought, well, we can cure those people and clean up this to a satisfactory level. And in some cases, you can't. It just can't be done. So if you have a highly sensitive buyer or somebody that you're trying to sell a house to, and especially if it has a crawl space, I'd try to push them to the next house, because you can't, I don't want you or anybody like me promising that our corrective actions are going to completely make them happy. We had one buyer that kept saying it was the mold in the house, and this went on forever, and they were unhappy. That was causing a divorce in the family now, and they were a young couple. And we find out the whole problem in the home was an odor from a floor coating that was put on the wood. So I'm just telling you, if you have somebody that's highly sensitive and they tell you this when they first walk into a house, usually I try to move them on to the next house. It's just going to save you a lot of problems. Now, we talked about the 3 things that we need for mold to grow, and that's the temperature, the nutrient base, and the moisture. But I want to tell you the difference between moisture caused by relative humidity versus moisture that's caused by actual water damage. Let me show you a picture. And before I get to that picture, let me tell you that finding mold, if we go after where is the moisture coming from, then we can usually find what the problem is and how to fix it. In most homes, the mold situation can be remediated, and you can get them back to normal. But in this picture here, for instance, the left-hand picture shows that spotted mold on the underside of the floor and on the floor joist. That spotting is telling us that this is caused by relative humidity rather than from a specific water event. So a lot of times, especially in foreclosed homes, when you have the bank that's so nice to turn off all the electricity and the air conditioning and everything in the foreclosed home to save on cost, what happens is the relative humidity gets so high in the basement that all of a sudden mold develops on the floor joist and on the underside of the flooring. The photo on the right shows mold that's developed and colonized due to an actual water event that occurred, and you can see the water stains. And so this leads you to a clue, hey, if I can fix the water stains here, then I can correct this type of situation. This This particular one on the left tells us we have to correct the relative humidity. I was in a building last night and I'll show you a trick on how to use your flashlight to find these things. It had mold everywhere due to a relative humidity issue with the building. And unfortunately, a lot of buildings have been vacant during the COVID crisis, and now people are starting to reoccupy them, and all of a sudden we've got a lot of complaints about mold or something like that. And many of the issues are around relative humidity. So when we get enough humidity in the air, and that means in excess of 60%, we have enough water in the air to actually cause a water event in essence. One of the other culprits that we find often is the humidifier that's attached to the furnace in many homes. But most people don't know how to operate these things. These should be off between the summer and the fall because we get enough humidity in the air here in St. Louis. But people don't know that, and they leave these things on, and unfortunately some of the air conditioning contractors don't tell them about it. And here you can see all the mold that's developed inside the humidifier, and it's just been spraying this through the house all summer long. Now, when we talk about relative humidity being high enough to cause these things, sometimes you can't see it. And so what I'm telling you as a trick is to take your flashlight and lay it parallel to the actual surface. You look at this door, and when I attach my flashlight to the door, it looks completely different. Now all of a sudden we have all this mold that shows up. This tells us that it's surface mold, and it's much easier for us to clean up than from a water event that damages something. We can restore this door in a couple minutes. So knowing the difference between a relative humidity problem and an actual water event can save your client a lot of money. Here's a hotel that I'm recently inspecting, and we've got a humidity problem in there. Everything looks fine in the left photo, but when you see I laid the flashlight down parallel to the surface, you can see the mold that's growing on the fabric and all these different spots. And so I don't want to freak you out, but this is something that happens in a lot of different situations. Here's one from Friday night. And what happened was, this is in a condo. They changed out the furnace unit, the air handling unit, in a closet that abuts this closet that I'm showing you. And the evaporator coil and the condensation pan had overflown, and it was clogged, and so all this water went in down to the floor, and when they changed out the air handling unit, they didn't clean up the water, and it traveled into this carpet, got the carpet wet, and now we've got all this mold that's developed in just 2 days just in this closet because of the relative humidity from that carpet being wet. Now, this is surface mold. However, underneath this baseboard where it's actually touching the carpet, the drywall will probably have to be removed because it's actually damp from that. So surface mold is much easier to clean up. When we have our flashlight like this on the surface, sometimes this drywall will look fine until somebody looks at it closely. These are things that your building inspector may bring up to you. There's less damage to the building materials. I've got an example of a couple that lives in Town and Country. They have a house in Michigan. They decide to leave for 3 weeks with their family on a Friday. They had people in that were cleaning the carpet on this Friday afternoon. They decided, well, let's leave early. And they told the carpet cleaning guys, hey, we're leaving early. Just run out the garage door, close the garage door when you're finished. And they left. Well, the carpet cleaning guys were thinking, well, it's Friday. We don't have to dry the carpets. The people aren't going to be here. They left the carpets wet, and the family had raised the air conditioning temperature to 82 before they left. And the next thing you know, the whole house, when they come back in 3 weeks, has mold on every wall in the house. We had people that went in there that wanted $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 to rip out just the drywall in this home to fix the situation. When it's surface mold, that drywall does not have to come out. There are certain chemicals that can be used that it can be cleaned up, and this whole house was cleaned up for less than $10,000. So it was an amazing difference. And so understanding the difference between these two types of mold is critical at this beginning stage. Another problem that you may run into, and I've run into it twice this year already, is we get an HVAC contractor that gets a great deal on a compressor unit. These are the units that sit outside that cool our air conditioning units. Well, if they're improperly sized for the house, what happens is we get something that's called short cycling. And short cycling is the air conditioning compressor unit is too big, and it gets to, let's say you set your room at 72 degrees. Since it's so large, it gets to that 72 within just a couple minutes versus waiting 8-10 minutes. And so it never allows the unit to take the moisture out of the air. So you're cool in there and everything, but the humidity is too high. And the reason is because of an improper air conditioning unit supplied by the HVAC contractor. And I've seen it twice already this year, and nobody knew what the problem was and why we had mold growing everywhere, but it was really basically because of the new air conditioning system. Now here's another issue. Sometimes I've got a rehab that was performed in Frontenac. Everything looked great in the house. And so we were part of the inspection process when the new buyer was buying the home. And as the visual inspection took place, we noticed that there were water stains like inside this closet in the basement. And that's a pretty big water stain. And so we recommended that they take an air sample in the basement just to make sure whoever did the rehab cleaned everything up properly. And we had a sky-high reading of mold in this house. The rehabber didn't, and they hid everything so well. It's hard for you to understand when going in to inspect a house what kind of problem we're going to have. So sometimes air sampling is beneficial. It doesn't cure every problem related to mold inspections, but it is beneficial in determining, hey, what are we breathing and what's going on inside the house. Now, when we talk about this surface mold due to a high relative humidity, and it looks like this on the wood paneling here in this basement, this can be cleaned up with regular HEPA vacuums or with HEPA fans, and you'll hear me talking about those. We call them air scrubbers sometimes. And this has a high efficiency particulate air filter in it that cleans down to 0.03 microns. So that if you've ever stood behind a shop vac after somebody's vacuuming, and it looks, if you're behind a shop vac and somebody's vacuuming, you're covered with the dirt that they vacuumed because they just don't filter out that dust. With HEPA vacuums, true HEPA vacuums and HEPA fans that I'll show you, they actually hold and maintain that none of this exits the air. So they have these great filters in them that are expensive. The same types of filters that we use in the operating rooms at the hospitals. And so when sometimes we're talking about air scrubbing, we're using any of these types of machines to suck in the air, take all the particles that are in the air and scrub them down. And the picture on the right is actually when mold remediation is occurring, we usually vent that outside the building. And then when that's all finished, then we take that venting out and just allow them to scrub the air in these rooms. And some of these can change the air in those rooms 15 times an hour. So it's very beneficial. And in many cases can be all that's needed in some homes that have just a relatively mild mold situation. You can scrub the air and improve the air. So we've told you about a little bit about what happens with the high relative humidity. I do want to tell you some things not to allow. And that's if somebody like us that's a mold inspector or somebody that comes in as a building inspector and wants to take air samples, do not allow them to take air samples in an attic space, a garage, or a crawl space. And the reason is these are unconditioned spaces of a home. That means we're not using that home's furnace and air handling unit to supply cold and hot air or warm air during the winter, and then having it return back to that unit and go through a filter and clean it. These areas are usually static. The attic areas usually have its own venting out of the side gables or fans on the roof. Garages usually have no ventilation other than when the garage door goes up and down. And crawl spaces may have outside vents that are opened and closed. But I've had many people that go in and they take an air sample in one of these things, and the next thing you know, you're going to have a lot of confusion because you're automatically going to get a high reading. And that high reading is because we're not cleaning the air. And it's going to do nothing but confuse your sale on both ends. And so we don't recommend that you allow air samples in those spaces because it's going to do nothing but confuse things. If they're worried and they say, hey, but it looks like we've got mold, I want to identify it, we can take a surface sample. So whoever's doing it can take a surface sample and identify it as mold. And as you'll find in many of these attic areas, and we've had, I don't know how many just this week alone, that the building inspector says there's attic area mold. Does this impact the people in the house? Not all the time, no. Unless there's an air handling unit in the attic that serves the upper floors, and then we may get transference of mold from the attic into that air handling unit. But for the most part, it's not going to cause a health problem in the house. However, it does cause a value problem with the house because people see it and they say, well, I don't want to buy it with it in there. And even though it's not going to do any safety or health issue problems, we don't want it. So everybody's having it removed because the buyer of that house, when they go to sell it, they're going to have it removed. So it's just kind of a chain cycle on those kinds of things when we run into attic area mold or crawl space mold. Crawl spaces are a little bit different because we usually have mechanical ductwork systems that travel through the crawl spaces, and so they can impact the health of the house. Now, another thing I want to warn you about is some of the inspectors that are out there. There's one in particular that states, and this confused a deal, and I don't remember if it was one of your agents or not, just a couple weeks ago. He went in and gave them a lowball price to do a mold inspection, and what he did was he took one surface sample and lots of pictures of mold throughout the house. And then he stated that there's a significant issue with the house and said what you need to do is hire him again to do a full inspection of the home and prepare a remediation price. Well, this not only slowed the process down, but when he came back with this remediation plan, it was $10,000, $20,000 to get rid. He wanted the wood floors removed and all kinds of things that didn't need to happen. And it was just a way to run up the bill on the client. So watch these things because the next thing you know, you've got a disclosure issue with somebody like this that gives you all this type of information. Mold, as I stated at the beginning, is ubiquitous. We can find mold anywhere. It's just, is it a mold that's problematic? Is it mold that's at a high enough level that's going to cause an issue? And is it mold that's going to become in the airstream? Mold that's dead or non-viable is still an allergen or a toxin to people. So even if we stop the water issue, for the most part, we have to get rid of the mold. Now, another thing is building inspectors. The labs are all calling the building inspectors because they can see they can build up more revenue. And the building inspectors like it because they can offer another service when they're doing an inspection on a house and say, hey, while we're here, I see mold. Do you want me to take an air sample? Do you want me to take a surface sample? And sometimes it's very beneficial. I would ask them, hey, if you take an air sample or if you take a surface sample, are you going to be able to interpret the results and tell us what to do? Because week after week, we get people that call us and send us those reports and say they don't know what to tell us to do. So watch for that because it's just going to slow down your transaction. Sometimes it's great. but it is something that we need to watch for. Now, I know I've thrown a lot of stuff at you, but this is kind of the beginning stages of mold. What I want to talk about in the next one, so I don't bore you to death with one long program, is understanding air sample reports, because they get very confusing. They're beneficial, but I've had a deal that was in Huntley, and the person said this house needs remediation because the indoor air sample result was over 800 spores. Now, 800 in the summer here in St. Louis is nothing. It's not, it doesn't mean that that house needs remediation. In fact, that house, the outside reading was 40,000. So you can see, we want somebody to understand these reports and how it actually relates to the house, so that we can get the right information and not mess up our deals. Now, in some cases, they may be right, but there are a lot of things that we don't want them to allow to do. And sometimes you're going to get a mold inspector because the building inspector found something wrong in the basement. The mold inspector says, hey, I won't look at the basement unless I look at every floor, and they want air samples from every floor. I wouldn't allow it. I would strictly adhere to what the building inspection report says and allow them to do the thing in the basement, but they're really just running up a bill on you on wanting to sample every other area of the house. New chemical products. There are some new chemicals out there that are amazing, especially with the surface mold, that we can apply that chemical to the drywall and it will clean the drywall and actually eat into the drywall and kill any of the mold and stop it from colonizing. It can save you from removing walls, ceilings, a lot of other things. Especially if you're removing ceilings, it impacts sometimes the attic insulation and stuff like that. So these new chemicals, and I'm going to show you how they react in that next training program, because I think they are beneficial.